Just over 3 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. It's a story that's been grabbing headlines ever since. But what if Putin didn't invade Ukraine because of threats from NATO and the European Union? What if this war was a war that has been ongoing for the last 3 centuries and had to do with agriculture? We answer that today. Citizens of Russia, friends, my address concerns the events in Ukraine and why this is so important for us, for Russia. Of course, my message is also addressed to our compatriots in Ukraine. The matter is very serious and needs to be discussed in depth. The situation in Donbass has reached a critical acute stage. I'm speaking to you directly, not only to explain what is happening, but also to inform you of the decisions being made as well as potential further steps. I would like to emphasize again that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us, not only colleagues, friends, and people who once served together, but also relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. This was the case before the 17th century, when a portion of this territory rejoined the Russian state and after. It seems to us that generally speaking, we all know these facts, that this is common knowledge. Still, it is necessary to say at least a few words about the history of this issue in order to understand what is happening today, to explain the motives behind Russia's actions and what we aim to achieve. And that, Patrick, joining the show on the history of fresh produce is Russian President Vladimir Putin. And that was actually the first several paragraphs of his speech on February 21st, 2022, when he and the country of Russia invaded the country of Ukraine. And today we're recording this episode with just a few days, really, of the US President Donald Trump announcing that he has had talks with Russia's President Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine, which has been going on now for nearly 3 years, right? And so it's actually quite appropriate what we'll be talking about today, which we've been planning to do an episode for a while now. And so today we're going to be going on a journey through history that is quite literally rooted in the soil, specifically the rich black soil of Ukraine.
That's rooted in history.
So we're going to be exploring. This might be a little different than the stories you've been hearing in the news about this event, but how fresh produce and agriculture have shaped this complex and often relationship between Russia and Ukraine.
And it does.
It really does.
I mean, it really does. So, let's begin with that black soil, though, shall we, John?
Let's do it.
Okay, because this isn't just any old dirt we're talking about.
Nope.
Ukraine boasts approximately a third of the world's supply of chernozem, the dark, humus-rich soil. No, I know what you're thinking. Not the chickpea spread.
No.
The dark organic matter in the soil that is formed by the decomposition of plant and animal matter that has made the region one of the most agriculturally productive places on earth, everyone. Yeah. Okay. So as we look at this, its fertility is legendary. And as we'll see it has been both a blessing and a curse throughout history. Now, John, if you were to compare Ukraine's climate to anywhere else, you'd probably land in Kansas. That's right, everyone. Kansas and Ukraine. Think about that. Think about that. That's where Superman was from, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Cornfields, wheat, all that. So in the same kind of prime wheat growing environment, but with an added advantage, though, that land isn't too flat, which prevents saturation problems, nor too hilly, which would make large scale cultivation difficult. 2/3 of Ukraine's land is farmed. And the eastern part of the country, in particular, is an absolute paradise for grain production. Now, today, Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, corn, rye, and barley, not to mention the dominant producer, which is sunflower oil.
And Patrick, all this abundance has obviously not gone unnoticed by history's great powers,
No.
right? I mean, the Greeks, the Romans, the Huns, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, all of these ancient civilization have had left their mark on the land. And for thousands of years, Ukraine has been this breadbasket of the wider region, feeding empires and fueling economies and military ambitions. And this is where geography meets geopolitics, right? Those ancient black paths carved through the landscape by ox cart drivers led straight to the Black Sea ports, linking Ukraine to the global grain trade long before the concept of globalization even existed. So from there, grain was shipped through the Turkish Straits, past the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, before making its way to the heart of the ancient Mediterranean world. And this isn't just some relic of the past. Even today, control over those straits remain a crucial military issue, particularly in light of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But before we jump ahead to that period in time, Patrick, let's take a step back to the first great Slavic state, the Kyivan Rus.
Yeah, the Kyivan Rus is definitely one we got to touch on, John, and that's where I think that the grand old ancestor of both Russia and Ukraine. At its height, this medieval state stretched across much of the modern day territories of both nations. The Grand Prince of Kyiv, Vladimir the Great, converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988, a moment that Vladimir Putin has repeatedly invoked to claim that Russian and Ukrainians are, in his words, one people, a single whole. Now, that's the modern spin, of course. But if we return to the Middle Ages, what we actually see is a land dominated by ag, particularly in those fertile black soil regions. The Rus farmed extensively, practicing a field rotation system known as paralog, and their markets were filled with grains of all kinds. Yet curiously, right, and curiosity, right, we don't have much evidence of large-scale grain production from the Kyivan Rus. So this is a little odd, given how central grain exporters were to later periods, of Ukraine's history. The reason likely lies in geography, though, John. Unlike Sicily or Egypt, both famous for supplying grain to imperial capitals, Kyiv was landlocked. Shipped grain across the Mediterranean was relatively easily. Transporting it over land from Kyiv to foreign markets, not so much. Instead, much of the grain seems to have stayed with the Rus economy. There's something intriguing, with evidence suggesting that grain may have been quietly traded over land to Byzantine Crimea, from where it could have made its way to the Constantinople, but where the realm of speculation comes in here now, John, since medieval chronicles weren't in that habitat of detailing their grocery lists, do we even know, right? And what we do know is that ag was already deeply embedded in the region's identity. Even archaeological evidence suggests that as far back as 3,000 years ago, John, Ukrainian farmers were harvesting wheat, barley, and millet, with rye appearing about a millennium later. So the Neolithical cultures of the regions may well have been the ancestors of Europe. Some of the earliest agricultural civilizations, as we've read. Now, as long as history of farming led to an equally long history of conflict over control of land, and I laugh on that because we have so many, John, that war comes with land, food, war, love, right?
Yep.
And so, John, as we move further into the medieval period, we'll see just how important Ukraine's agriculture bounty became, particularly as the Black Sea traded and exploded in significance. And we know that.
Yeah. So let's take a look at that period then. So by the 11th century, Ukraine wasn't just growing wheat, okay? It was diversifying. Trade routes are bringing buckwheat from Asia along with melons and eggplants. But still, the most important crop remained wheat. And by the 13th century, technological advancements like water mills, like windmills, are starting to make grain processing much more efficient. And that is further cementing Ukraine's role as a major agricultural hub. And this, Patrick, is where the Black Sea starts to take center stage. So during this so-called Black Sea boom of the 13th to 15th centuries, a new wave of economic players arrive on the scene. And those, of course, are the Venetians and the Genoese. And these maritime powers turned this northern Black Sea coast into a thriving hub of commerce. And grain was at the heart of it. Venetian and Genoese merchants took full advantage of Ukraine's agricultural surplus, exporting just vast quantities of wheat to the Mediterranean. In fact, there was so much grain flowing southward that merchants could consult these handbooks. There's this famous one by Francesco Balducci Pegolotti, and they would use these handbooks to determine which specific regions produce the best quality wheat. And so this gave Venice and Genoa an extraordinary amount of leverage over the Byzantine Empire. So by controlling Ukraine's grain exports, they could effectively blackmail Constantinople with the threat of starvation. And a tactic that, in a way, foreshadows Russia's own use of grain exports as a geopolitical tool in the modern era, which we'll get to that later in the episode. Now, meanwhile, a new threat is emerging from the east during this time. The Mongols, led by Batu Khan, has conquered the Kyivan Rus in the 13th century, bringing the region under the rule of the Golden Horde. And we actually talked about the Golden Horde last year in an episode. So if you want to hear more about Mongols and the Golden Horde and produce, listen to that episode. But on the subject of the Mongols, they didn't really end up interfering much with local agricultural practices here. And we talked about this in that episode that we did. They just demanded tribute. And so that resulted obviously in some redirecting some of that region's agricultural wealth toward their own empire in the east. So even in the Middle Ages, Ukraine is caught between powerful forces. You got Western European traders on one side, you got Mongols on the other. And as we're going to see later, these patterns of exploitation, strategic importance would only intensify as we move more and more into the early modern period.
And I think it goes, showing to John too, is how much there's so much going on within history. I keep saying it over and over again. Is like, even though we're sitting here learning day after day, how much is really out there that, we don't know and the community doesn't know. I mean, like I said, in this modern period. But what about the Russian Empire? I mean, I think that, we got to get into the Russian Empire, right? I think we do. And so as we've set the stage with Ukraine's deep agricultural roots, the medieval trade networks, and the growing significance in feeding Europe, right, John? Now our story moves into one of conquest, empire building, and the long struggle over the land and its bounty. And that brings us, to the Russian Empire. And now, John, when we think of Russian expansion, it's often Peter the Great who gets all the credit for turning Russia into European power. But it was actually Catherine the Great who really pushed the empire southward, seizing lands that would become central to Russia's agricultural might. And nowhere was the more apparent than in Ukraine. Catherine's ambitions weren't just about land for the sake of land. She understood something crucial. Control of Ukraine meant control of the grain that could feed Europe. And that in turn meant wealth and power for Russia. She wasn't just building an empire. She was constructing an agricultural powerhouse. So in 1768, Catherine began her long and brutal campaign against the Crimean Khaganate and that Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just about military conquest. It was about ensuring that the rich black soil of Ukraine and its vital trade routes fell under Russian control. The very same roots we now see playing such a crucial role in contemporary geopolitics. And the culmination of this was the annexation of Crimea in 1783. That was a major turning point. Catherine secured Russia's access to the Black Sea, opening up Odessa as a crucial grain port. Before this, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had dominated grain exports to Europe using the Vistula River to funnel wheat through Gdansk, but Catherine had bigger ambitions, okay? She wanted Russia, the grain, to flood the European markets, and she wanted it to rival and not surpass the grain trade networks of Poland, Sweden, and the Baltic states.
Yeah, and you mentioned Odessa there, and I think it's important to note how pivotal this was to all this, because this is a city which has made the news quite a bit during this whole modern day events. And it was a city that was established in 1795, and it was a city that was built from the ground up with trade, specifically of grain, in mind. It's positioned strategically between ancient Greek colonies like Tyras and Olbia, and it was actually named in the Slavic feminine form of the Greek city Odessos.
Ah.
So while it had classical roots, the function of this city was thoroughly modern, feeding this rapidly growing working class of industrial Europe.
Yes, and this was where it gets fascinating too, because by the 19th century, Ukrainian grain shipped from Odessa was supplying the factory workers of London, Liverpool, Amsterdam, and Antwerp. Cheap Ukrainian wheat kept European industrialization going. And while we often talk about coal and steel as the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution, in many ways, it was actually bread. And that brings us to one of the most intriguing and largely forgotten figures in all of this, Israel Alexander Halpan, better known by his pen name, Parvis. Now, John, you loved a good overlook historical figure, right? Why don't you tell us about Parvis right now?
Yeah, he's an extraordinary character. So a quick pen portrait of this guy. So he's born in actually Belarus in the 1860s. He ends up moving and growing up in Odessa, works on the docks. He's watching the grain leave for cities, like you said, of Liverpool, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, these industrial growing cities. But he wasn't just an observer. He was a thinker, and he realized that grain wasn't just food. It was a weapon of economic and political power. And he called cities like London and Antwerp consumption accumulation cities, places that took in these raw goods and turned them into economic dominance. And so in the 1870s, he saw firsthand how Jewish merchants in Odessa controlled the grain trade. And they signed these long-term contracts to buy grain and transport it by ox caravan across the vast plains of Ukraine and Russia. And the system sustained Europe's growing urban populations. But it also made Parvis acutely aware of the inequalities within the trade itself. So whoever controlled and supplied, who profited, and who, of course, suffered under the weight of these vast economic forces.
Wow. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I mean, it came up pretty fast, really fast. But and I say it's absolutely amazing. And this is where it all ties back to Catherine. Okay, Catherine the Great. She had put this entire structure in place by expanding Russians' wheat production through increasing the power of landlords over serfs. It really made the serfs more like slaves. Yeah. She turned Ukraine into an economic engine, but as I've just alluded to, she did so at a great human cost, especially to the Jewish population. Catherine, like the Tsars before her, implemented harsh anti-Semitic policies and restricted Jewish merchants to the Pale of Settlement, a vast territory that included much of Ukraine, and ensured that while they could facilitate trade, they couldn't own the land that produced the grain, though, John.
Yeah, and this tension between those who grew the grain and those who traded and those who ultimately profited, set the stage for these deep economic and political conflicts in the centuries to come. Because while grain might have fed Europe in this industrial period, it also fueled revolutions.
Well, and that, John, brings us to one of the greatest, ironies of history is Catherine's policies, which made Russia an agricultural superpower, also helped set the conditions for the various socialist movements that would later seek to overthrow the empire. Now, everybody, more right after the break. We will be right back.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. And before break, we left off with basically the period of Catherine the Great, and also post period of Catherine the Great, talking about how this economic agricultural machine that is Ukraine is powering the Russian Empire,
It
of
is.
course, at the expense of a lot of
Of course.
serfs and minority people in the empire.
Yes.
And but of course, before that, we were even tracing this long and brutal history of Ukraine from even its early days under Slavic rule. But now we're going to turn to the 20th century. This is when Ukraine finds itself at the mercy of an even more ruthless regime, which of course is the Soviet Union.
Yes.
So let's dissect that period a little bit. So at the start of the 1900s, Ukraine is still under the Russian Empire at this time. And in 1909, there's some major land reforms that are being introduced. So remember, Catherine's policies had significantly increased power of the nobles over the serfs, keeping millions of these peasants trapped in this exploitative conditions, and this, of course, leading to periods of unrest. So as a response to that unrest, under these new land reforms, every peasant, at least in theory, is given the opportunity to become a landowner. But of course, all that would be swept away by the political upheavals of the century. And that, of course, happens in 1917 as the Russian Revolution explodes, thanks in part to Catherine's agricultural policies. Ukraine's Central Rada, basically it's this region's elected council, declares the country's right to self-governance within Russia. It's a bold statement, but hardly a full declaration of independence. That came actually a year later in 1918. And so with the Bolsheviks advancing, Ukraine declared full independence. And here you see the geopolitical chaos of the time. Ukraine, desperate to maintain its sovereignty, signs a treaty with Central Powers, hoping that German and Austrian forces would help fend off the Bolsheviks. And they do for some time, to their credit, but there was a cost. The Germans, during this time, install a puppet leader within the region. And as soon as World War I ends, the foreign troops withdraw from the region, leaving Ukraine just completely vulnerable once more.
Wow. More
Yeah.
and more. There's
Yeah.
just, John,
It's a
there's so
region
much.
that just keeps trading hands over and over again.
I mean, there's just, again, right? There's so much to learn, over and over. And yes, and let's not forget the Western Ukraine, which also briefly declared independence that same year, if you recall reading about
Yep.
what. But that effort was crushed by Poland, whose newly restored state had its own territorial ambitions. In the end, Ukraine was carved up, and by 1922, it had been fully absorbed into the Soviet Union. Now, John, let's talk about Stalin, because this is where history takes an especially dark turn. In the early 30s, Stalin implemented one of the most brutal policies in modern history, a man-made famine known today as the Holodomor.
Right. And we've actually talked about this to some degree last year again during our Olympic series when we highlighted Russia and talked about Vavilov.
Yep.
And Vavilov was caught in this period of history and Stalin's insane philosophies on collectivization. And that's what was the force that caused this famine. So what is collectivization? So, as a reminder to our listeners, this is basically a system that forced Ukrainian peasants into massive estate run farms. And the Ukrainians at this time resisted. Farming was more than just an economic activity, it was a way of life. And as we've kind of painted briefly, we've gone through this history very quickly. This has been a way of life for many of them for centuries. So, Stalin responds with brutal force. He requisitions grains at levels that guaranteed starvation of the masses. And scholars even estimate that about 6 to 10 million people perished from these famine related causes. And that wasn't all. So Stalin then imported large numbers of Russians and other Soviet citizens to repopulate the eastern regions, many of whom who didn't speak Ukrainian. So this fundamentally alters the region's demographic balance, a legacy that still influences Ukrainian politics today. And it's crucial to understand these divisions because Eastern Ukraine had been under Russian rule far longer than the West. And with the demographic shift imposed by Stalin, right, when he's bringing in all these Russians to replace all the people he essentially killed, it became even more Russian speaking, more Orthodox. Western Ukraine, meanwhile, had long been influenced by European powers like Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is why to this day it's more Ukrainian speaking and has a stronger Catholic tradition. So these historical legacies are not just abstract ideas. They shape political alignments to the modern era. So if we fast forward to the Cold War era, and you see the continued importance of Ukrainian agriculture. So after World War II, the Soviets poured billions into expanding grain production elsewhere in Russia. But even then, Ukraine remained the empire's breadbasket. And by the 1980s, it still wasn't enough. The Soviet Union had to import massive amounts of grain. And when oil prices dropped in the mid 1980s, the cost of these imports, as one could imagine, helped trigger a financial crisis.
Right.
Arguably one of the key events leading to the collapse of the USSR.
Now, that's a fascinating point, though, John, because people often think of the Cold War ending because of Reagan, Gorbachev, and or the fall of the Berlin Wall. But in reality, the Soviet Union's economic collapse, driven in part by its inability to sustain food production, played an enormous role, my friend.
Oh yeah, and with that collapse, Ukraine was finally in a position to reclaim its independence. But as we'll see, the ghosts of the Soviet past continued to haunt its future.
Well, let's look at some of those modern geopolitics too. So by 1991, Ukraine is independent, but uniting this vast and historically divided country into no simple feat. Okay. The country's transition to democracy and capitalism were turbulent. And for many in the East, the nostalgia for Soviet era stability persisted. But what makes Ukraine so pivotal in modern geopolitics isn't just its location, it's its land. So when we look at a topographical map, you can actually see the divide quite clearly. The south and east are the steppe regions, open, fertile plains that have been cultivated for centuries, right? While the north and west are more forested. The divide isn't just geographical, it aligns strikingly with Ukraine's political history, with the western part leaning towards Europe and the east having closer ties to Russia. And when we talk about fertile land, we mean fertile land. As we mentioned at the top of this episode, Ukraine boasts some of the richest black soil in the world, everyone, with 41 million hectares of agricultural land, an area larger than Germany, a third of all the arable land in the European Union. Couldn't match Ukraine's potential. But the land, rather than being a unifying factor, has become a source of economic and political turmoil. Mismanaged privatization efforts after 1991 led to the rise of an oligarchic class, concentrating ownership into the hands of a few powerful individuals and large agribusinesses. By the early 2000s, over 9 million hectares, nearly a third of Ukraine's arable land, were controlled by the oligarchs, foreign investors, and corrupt enterprises, John, which we've seen before over and over again throughout history. The government itself estimated that 5 million hectares had been outright stolen. And this has direct geopolitical implications. Ukraine's agricultural bounty isn't just important for its economy, it's a linchpin in global food security. Before the war, Ukraine was one of the world's top exporters of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, feeding markets from Europe to Africa and even the Middle East.
Yeah. And now this brings us to Vladimir Putin, the big man of the age in Russia. And obviously his interest in Ukraine isn't just about history or politics, it's about food. And the Russian Empire, and later, obviously, the Soviet Union, maintained its dominance by controlling, as we've been painting here, Ukraine's agricultural exports. So even though Ukraine became independent in 1991, Russia managed to maintain its power over Ukraine through a combination of bribery and intimidation. But after the Euromaidan protests of 2013-14, which, if you might recall, Patrick, I remember when I was reading about this, throwing me back a little over 10 years ago, seeing this in the news. This was these protests happening in Ukraine that was sparked by the then president of Ukraine, which was Viktor Yanukovych, whose sudden decision not to sign the European Union Ukraine Association Agreement and instead chose closer ties to Russia. And once these protests broke out, basically Russian control of the state of Ukraine breaks down. So this isn't just a war of ideology or even purely about security concerns, though, of course, NATO and the European Union factor into the equation. This is also a war over grain, over food security, over who controls the world's breadbasket. And what's remarkable is how clearly, and you may be seeing this now as we've been talking through this episode, how clearly history repeats itself. Ukraine's flat prairies, its rich black soils, its deep water ports in the Black Sea, these have been the very things that have attracted invaders and empire builders for centuries. The Soviet Union, the Russian Empire before it, and now Putin's Russia all have understood that controlling Ukraine means controlling a vital artery of global food production.
Wow. And precisely on point, John. If you look at when Dmitry Medvedev called food Russia's silent weapon, he wasn't making explicit what was long been implicit in Russia's strategy. And Putin in recent years has been increasingly overt about it too.
Yeah.
The attacks on Ukraine's agriculture infrastructure, the efforts to replace Ukrainian grain exports with Russian ones, and even the black market trade in Ukraine's prized chernozem soil. It's all points to a larger strategy, John.
Yeah, and that strategy is really twofold, right? First, it's to weaken Ukraine's position as an independent economic force, making it more reliant, of course, on Russian influence. And the second, is to consolidate Russia's own standing as a global agricultural power, ensuring that nations that depend on grain, particularly Africa and the Middle East, are looking to Moscow rather than to Kyiv for their food supply. And Russian state media reported actually in 2024, so just last year, that Putin's economic goal for the coming decade is to elevate Russia to the fourth largest economy in the world, moving away from dependence on oil and gas exports. So instead, he sees agriculture, Russia's growing wheat empire, as a key driver of future economic power. And this, Patrick, is where things become so fascinating. Because in an era dominated by technology, energy markets, you might think that land and ag have lost their geopolitical significance. But in fact, we are seeing quite the opposite in this event. Russia's vast wheat exports are already a major source of revenue. And as climate change, which we all know about, disrupts food production elsewhere, control over arable land is becoming even more critical. And of course, let's not forget that food prices have a way of shaping history, right? So, I mean, if you want to go way, way back, we also did an episode on this when we talked about the French Revolution and the droughts and the challenges with food production at that period led in part to the French Revolution. In more modern times, raising wheat prices helped spark the Arab Spring. So when you had the fall of Mubarak in Egypt in this century, that was related to droughts in Russia that caused less wheat going to the Middle East, and then of course prices going up. Grain shortages can topple governments. So if Russia can exert control over a quarter of the global wheat trade, then it isn't just reshaping Ukraine's fate. That's just a small element of it. It is potentially reshaping the political landscape of the world. So now this brings us back to the fundamental question. Is Putin seeking to rebuild the Russian Empire in its entirety? I would say no, probably not. But is he attempting to recreate the old imperial system in which Ukraine is not so much a country in its own right, but more of a subservient extension of Russian power? And to that, I would say absolutely. Putin doesn't really fear NATO or the EU status of Ukraine. He rather desires continued power over the railway corridors and the dockyards that pass through Ukraine to the deep water ports. Those ancient pathways are both Russia's lifeline to world markets and a convenient siphon for control by Russian oligarchs. So a truly independent Ukraine threatens that power, and that is what terrifies Putin.
Yeah, and therein lies the historical tragedy of Ukraine, a nation of extraordinary agricultural wealth. Yet, for much of its history, that wealth has been exploited by outside powers. And the question now is whether Ukraine can finally break free of that pattern or whether history will once again repeat itself.
It's a gripping question, Patrick, and one I certainly suspect that history will answer soon enough with all the stuff we've been seeing in the news recently. And when
Indeed.
when I saw this news with Trump saying, "Oh, he's had a call with Putin and they're going to come up with a peace," and after having done all this research, you know, I'm very curious to see how that settlement's going to look like because they've made it already clear. If I don't know if you've been following the news on this issue, but the Secretary of Defense of the United States already said that going back to pre 2014 borders is not realistic part of this deal.
I agree.
And if you look at a map of Ukraine and what Russia has taken, a lot of it is the northern Black Sea coastline.
I
And
know.
what's there after we've been talking? It's those black soils. It's those rich
That's what they want.
agricultural things. And it's also access to the ports. Now, it doesn't include Odessa. They haven't gotten to Odessa yet. But they do have some access to other ports along the Black Sea coast. So it's going to be very interesting to see if that settles because once again,
I know.
history to a degree will repeat because Russia, as it has always wanted since Catherine the Great, they wanted access
Yes.
to that part of Ukraine. They could care less about the western side of Ukraine, the forests and stuff. They don't care about that. They want the eastern, but more importantly,
They know what they
oh,
want.
they absolutely know that. It's
They
infused
know
in
what
their
they want.
DNA. It's been something that's been uh, something they've desperately wanted for centuries. And so once you understand history, and that's why we always talk about these things here. We talk obviously about produce and the importance of understanding where our food comes from and the role it's played in our culture and our history. But understanding
Correct.
just pure history, and in this case it relates to produce, really explains a lot about why things happen. The news always positions that, oh, Putin's a madman. He's insane because he's trying to attack and I'm not I'm not supporting Putin's actions in invading or endorsing it. But once you understand the history behind it, you d- it's it's crazy to say that he's crazy. This is not crazy. This is something that this country, this empire has been going after for centuries. And there's
Yeah,
a
yes,
very intentional
exactly.
reason behind it. He's not doing it just to kill people. Maybe a part of it is, who knows? I'm not in Putin's brain, but I can tell you with with a high level of certainty, a big part of this has to do with economics and with food. And that's what
Yeah,
a lot of
it
history is.
does.
It's food and power.
It it does. Like I said, food, power, like I said, love, it all goes together. So I
Yeah.
100% agree with you.
So that's our quick
That's our story and we're sticking
That's our
to it,
quick rundown
everyone.
on Ukraine-Russia relations through agriculture. Hopefully, it's
Yes.
given our listeners somewhat of a alternative perspective on this whole war that's been consuming headlines.
And that's
Right,
what we wanted. We want to give you a new
exactly.
perspective, right? We don't want you to think that our way is the right way or the wrong way. Again, people that are listening, please, if you see any discrepancies, anything, please, we'd love to hear from you because John and I do our research on this and just try to provide you the best information as possible. And as always, if you want to get that information before anybody else, the History of Fresh Produce Club, you can get all episodes, you can get discounts on books, you can kind of get the resources of where John and I get the
Yep.
information from. You can watch more videos and have some fun. And also we definitely want to drop it because we are working very hard on it, that by the end of this year we will have our History of Fresh Produce Volume 1 that will be coming out. And that is a book, everyone. It's going to be a surprise to a lot of people out there. We're giving you the first listen. So if you're listening now, please join the HFP Club because we're going to give some special giveaways and special discounts when that first volume comes out as well. So please join the HFP Club today and support history in the
Absolutely.
making.
And also make sure to check the show notes. We have access to a bi-weekly newsletter, which has a great additional content. If you wanted to hear or
Yes.
read more on stuff that's related to the episode that we did, but we didn't necessarily have time to go down those tangents, kind of gives you additional
Yep.
stories that kind of go hand in glove with the episode. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already. It's a fun read. It's not a long read. It's like a
Yep.
5 to 10 minute read, and gives you more history if that's what you were desiring. So
If that's what you want.
So anyway, until oh gosh, I have to get rid of this cough. Until next time, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And me, Patrick Kelly.